You know that feeling when high school spits you out and you're just adrift? Like you spent 12 years learning Pythagorean theorems and dissecting frogs, but nobody ever taught you how to actually want something? Yeah, that was me, Travis. Diploma in hand, future blanker than a freshly wiped chalkboard. College sounded like debt with a side of existential dread. A job felt like trading youthful apathy for soul-crushing routine under some fluorescent-lit tyrant. So, naturally, I embraced the noble path of the nocturnal gamer and daytime sleeper. My parents, bless their exasperated hearts, issued the classic ultimatum: find a purpose or find a new address. Lovely. The job hunt in my sleepy town was bleak. Factory drone or flipping burgers. Take your pick. I carpet bombed the area with applications, not even remembering half the places I applied to, which is probably how I ended up getting the call. Unknown number. Heavy, old southern drawl on the other end, practically buzzing with excitement about meeting me. Said the name was King Creole. Said I was hired. I just remember thinking, finally, something to shut mom and dad up. I didn't even recall applying to a place called Old King Creole's. Turns out it wasn't just called Old King Creole's. It was Old King Creole's half-priced voodoo shop. Glorified shack, really crammed onto a forgotten strip of highway just outside town. Looked like it might collapse if a strong wind blew, yet somehow it felt older, more rooted than the hills themselves. The inside hit you first with the smell, dust thick as velvet, something sickly sweet like decaying flowers, and a sharp, metallic tang underneath it all. Cobwebs draped everything like morbid decorations. Shelves overflowed with jars filled with murky liquids and unidentifiable bits. Shrunken heads grinned from dark corners, and dolls, gods, the dolls, hundreds of them, lining an entire wall, floor to ceiling. Glass eyes, button eyes, some with no eyes at all, just empty sockets. And they watched. You felt them watch. My job, as explained by the man himself, King Creole KC, he insisted, was simple. Ring up sales. Dolls and potions, mostly. Need a wart gone. Potion. Shitty parent forgot little Timmy's birthday? Doll. No returns if Timmy's soul gets vacuumed into it. Fine print, you see. But the real draw? The sign outside screamed it in flickering neon. Free wishes. Real ones, apparently. KC handled those personally. My only involvement was cleaning up the aftermath when a wish went sideways, which KC mentioned with a disturbing chuckle. Happened often enough to keep the mop bucket busy. Think 'em through, son, he'd rasped, his voice muffled behind the stitches. Wishes have teeth. Ah yes, KC, let's talk about the boss. Imagine Tim Burton having a nightmare after drinking too much absinthe. Lanky, unnaturally pale, like chalk dust or old bones. Messy black hair that looked perpetually startled. A threadbare, vaguely Victorian suit with a dark purple tie and a top hat. Yes, even indoors. And the face, oh, the face, button eyes. Big, black, sewn-on button eyes that seemed to absorb the light. And his mouth, stitched shut, crisscrossing black threads held his lips together, stretching into the corners, continuing down his throat and around his neck like a gruesome necklace. Sometimes, when he turned his head too fast, you'd hear a faint snip sound, see the stitches strain, watch his head wobble precariously. It was unsettling. He moved with a jerky, stop-motion quality, sometimes appearing right behind you without a sound. Personal space wasn't in his vocabulary. First day, he grabbed my hand, pulled me close, those button eyes inches from mine. his grip ice-cold and surprisingly strong. His skin felt like old parchment stretched too tight, and I swear I saw tiny cracks appear when he smiled, a grotesque stretching of the threads. My check-in involved stabbing a pin into a blank, featureless voodoo doll kept on the counter. Blank, but I swear that thing watched me more intently than the others, especially when I was slacking off on my phone. This little fabric head would just turn, and the dust, gods, the dust. It wasn't normal dust. You could wipe down the counter, turn around, and it would be back, thick and gray, like grave dirt. I gave up after the first week, started drawing pictures in it instead. Then there was the basement. Heavy oak door, multiple locks, right next to Casey's office. I was told, in no uncertain terms, on my first day, never go down there. Not that I wanted to. The sounds alone were enough deterrent. Scrabbling like rats the size of dogs. Wet, guttural sobbing. And the knocking, sometimes frantic, sometimes a slow, rhythmic thump. Thump, thump, that vibrated through the floorboards. Freaky murder basement, I called it in my head, and I wasn't touching it. The place seemed to stock itself, which was convenient, I guess. Jars refilled overnight. Dolls reappeared on the wall. Made the days drag even more, though. Nothing to do but wait. Listen to the basement noises. Feel the dolls watching. And try not to think too hard about KC's sewn-up smile. It was my second week, deep into the soul-numbing rhythm of dust and dread, when she walked in. The rusty bell above the door gave its usual mournful clang, startling me off my phone. She looked about my age, maybe a year or two older, dressed in workout gear despite the crisp autumn air outside. Definitely jogging, saw the flickering neon sign Free Wishes, and couldn't resist. Curiosity killed the cat, satisfaction brought it back, right? We'll see about that. She wrinkled her nose as she stepped inside, eyes darting around at the cobwebs and general grime, pointedly avoiding the wall of staring dolls. Good instincts. Their collective gaze felt like a physical weight as she approached the counter. "Welcome to Old King Creole's half-priced voodoo shop," I mumbled, trying for my best. I totally get paid enough for this voice. "What can I get for you?" "Hi." She hesitated, tapping a finger on the dusty counter, leaving a clean streak. The sign outside said, "Free Wishes?" Her brow furrowed, skepticism warring with hope in her eyes. "How exactly does that work?" "Yeah, wishes are the boss's department," I replied, already dreading the inevitable. "Hang tight. I'll go fetch him." She nodded, looking distinctly uncomfortable, probably rethinking her life choices. Can't blame her. I slid off my stool, stretched the kinks out of my back, and headed towards Casey's office at the back. As I passed the basement door, the frantic banging started up again, louder this time. I flinched, quickening my pace. Reached the office, knocked 3 times, like protocol dictated. "Hey, Mr. Creole, got a customer asking about a wish." Silence. Weird. He usually responded instantly. Knocked again, louder. Still nothing. Then, a piercing scream erupted from the front of the shop. I whipped around. KC was standing right there at the counter, beside the girl, grinning his stitched grin. He hadn't passed me. There was no other door. The laws of physics just seemed to politely excuse themselves whenever KC was around. "I do apologize for startling you, darling," KC rasped, tipping his top hat. The girl, Melissa, I'd learned was pale, hand pressed to her chest. "Forget sometimes my appearance frightens the faint of heart." He chuckled, that dry, rattling sound. What? How did you? Melissa stammered. Now, what can I do for you? Melissa? Casey asked, ignoring her question, already knowing her name. Her eyes widened, flicking towards me as if asking, "Did you tell him?" I just shrugged helplessly. Dude knows things. How does the wish work? She asked, trying to regain her footing. Simple. KC spread his gloved hands, the near-invisible strings shimmering between his fingers. You ask little ol' me for a wish, and I grant it. No strings attached. He wiggled the actual strings dangling from his fingers. Though I do ask you think it through very thoroughly. Wishes. His voice dropped, the stitched smile tightening. Have a very bad tendency of backfiring. For a fleeting moment, that strange sadness flickered in his button eyes again. Gone in an instant. Travis. KC turned to me. Be a good boy. Fetch the brown satchel from under my office desk. Confused, I was never allowed in there, but needing the distraction, I nodded. Sure thing, boss. I glanced back at Melissa, who looked like she desperately wanted to bolt, before heading back past the now silent basement door. Casey's office, as always, was jarringly spotless. No dust, no cobwebs, just a heavy oak desk, a worn leather chair, and those disturbing, scratched-out photos on the wall. Found the satchel easily enough under the desk. Heavy, smelled faintly of formaldehyde and something else. Spices? Returned to the front to find Melissa looking deeply uncomfortable but resolved. KC beamed. Travis, good boy. Right on time. He took the satchel, slammed it onto the counter, kicking up a choking cloud of that damnable grave dirt dust. Both Melissa and I coughed, waving the air. KC rummaged inside, humming tunelessly. His smile grew impossibly wider, threads straining at the corners of his mouth. Aha! He pulled out a small, fancy-looking jar. Looked like high-end skin cream. Now then, he cooed, turning to Melissa. Your exact wish was that you never wanted acne problems ever again, correct? Melissa flushed, glancing nervously at me, but nodded. Well, go on, darling. Try it out, KC urged, holding the jar out to her. She hesitated, then took it, unscrewed the lid, looked inside, just plain white cream, took a deep breath, dipped a finger in, and applied it to her cheeks, forehead, chin, rubbing in small circles. Then, she pulled out her phone, opened the camera app, and stared at her reflection, waiting. And then, the screaming started again. Not surprised this time. Pure, unadulterated agony. Her skin sizzled, like dropping water onto a searing hot skillet. It bubbled, turned red, then brown, then black, before starting to melt. Thick, greasy, pinkish fluid dripped from her face onto the counter, onto the floor. The smell was horrific, burning flesh, acrid chemicals. Worse than anything I'd smelled before. What the hell is this? She shrieked, clawing at her face, her fingers sinking into the melting flesh, pulling away strips of skin that clung like grotesque cheese. I stumbled back, gagging, hands clamped over my mouth. This was worse than I could have imagined. You asked for no more acne, dear? KC hummed calmly over her screams, watching the spectacle with detached amusement. Now you won't have to worry about that ever again. No skin, no acne. He chuckled softly. Melissa collapsed, her face a bubbling, liquefying horror show. Her hands weren't spared either. Skin sloughed off, revealing glistening tendons and white bone underneath. Within what felt like an eternity but was probably less than 2 minutes, she was gone. Just a steaming, coagulating puddle of blood, melted fat, unrecognizable tissue, and stark white bones on the floor in front of my counter. I was shaking, hyperventilating, vision swimming. KC turned his button eyes to me, his stitched smile serene. "Travis," he said, his voice disturbingly gentle. "Be a good boy and clean up this mess, please." He gestured towards the horrific pile. "Put the leavings in a trash bag. Toss it into the basement. I'll be down there." I stared at him, then at the remains, then back at him. "Clean that? I stammered, shivering. He gripped my shoulder, his touch freezing cold even through my shirt. His button eyes seemed to drill into mine. "Clean up." He produced the basement key, unlocked the heavy door, and slipped inside, pulling it shut behind him. The sounds from below ceased instantly. Left alone with the gruesome evidence of a wish gone horribly wrong, I grabbed the rubber gloves and the mop, my stomach churning, the smell thick enough to taste. This wasn't in the job description. $20 an hour suddenly felt like nowhere near enough. As I knelt down, trying not to vomit again, something small and white glinted in the bloody mess near where Melissa's skull fragments lay. A piece of broken porcelain. I picked it up, wiped it instinctively on my jeans, and shoved it into my pocket without thinking. Then, I took a deep breath and started the grim task of bagging up what was left of Melissa. Cleaning up what used to be a person is something else. The smell alone was an assault, thick and coppery sweet, clinging to the back of my throat. I pulled on the thick rubber gloves stashed under the counter, grabbed the heaviest duty trash bag I could find, and got to work. Or tried to. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Scooping up bones felt obscene. They were lighter than I expected, slick with stuff. I tried not to look too closely, focusing on the task, breathing shallowly through my mouth. Organs, or what I guess were organs, were harder, gelatinous, slippery. I gagged repeatedly, while burning my throat, but somehow kept it down. Skipping breakfast had been a blessing in disguise. The whole process felt like wading through a nightmare made tangible. Every squelch, every clink of bone against bone, amplified in the dead silence of the shop. Finally, the bag was heavy, bulging obscenely. I tied it off tight, my fingers fumbling with the knot. Then came the mopping. Hot water, bleach, lots of bleach, trying to erase the dark, spreading stain on the floorboards. The dust mixed with the gore, creating a thick, horrifying sludge that clung to the mop head. It took what felt like hours, scrubbing until my arms ached and the floor was still suspiciously dark, but marginally cleaner. Then came the basement. I dragged the heavy bag across the floor, leaving a faint smear despite my efforts. Stood before the heavy oak door KC had disappeared through. It looked ancient, banded with rusted iron, the wood dark and scarred. Hesitantly, I reached for the knob, cold, took a deep breath, steeling myself, and pulled it open. Pitch blackness yawned before me. A wave of cold, damp air washed over me, carrying a smell worse than Melissa's remains, decay, mildew, something metallic like old blood, and an underlying, indescribable wrongness. I couldn't hear anything moving down there now, just silence, a heavy, waiting silence. Holding the flashlight app on my phone with a trembling hand, I pointed it down. The light barely penetrated the oppressive dark, revealing only the first few rickety wooden steps descending into nothingness. Looking back at the bag, then down into the abyss, I swallowed hard. No way in hell was I going down there. With a grunt, I hefted the bag and swung it, chucking it into the darkness. It landed with a sickeningly wet thud somewhere below, followed by a faint skittering sound that made my skin crawl. I slammed the door shut instantly, leaning my full weight against it, heart hammering. Listened. Nothing. Just my own ragged breathing. As I backed away, my foot kicked something on the floor near the basement door. It was that piece of white porcelain I'd pocketed earlier. I picked it up again. Looked clean now, wiped off by my jeans pocket. Just a curved shard, maybe from a vase or an old doll. Smooth on one side, rough on the broken edge. Didn't seem important. Shoved it back in my pocket. I retreated behind the counter, collapsing onto the uncomfortable stool, feeling utterly drained and violated. Pulled out my phone, fingers still shaking as I mindlessly scrolled, trying to distract myself from the horror, the smell, the echoing thud from the basement. The voodoo doll on the counter seemed to be giving me the stink eye again. 30 minutes crawled by before the basement door creaked open. KC emerged, dusting off his top hat, that stitched smile firmly back in place. He hummed a tuneless, cheerful melody as he locked the basement door again, pocketing the key. He glanced towards the counter where I sat, then peered over at the floor where Melissa had met her end. "Excellent work, Travis," he chirped, striding over, seemingly oblivious to the lingering stench. He clapped me on the back, hard enough to make me grunt, then wrapped an arm around my shoulders, pulling me close. His chalky skin felt unnaturally cold, just like a proud father seeing his son catch his first fish. He chuckled. His button eyes gleamed. "Why don't you take the rest of the day off?" he suggested brightly. "For all your trouble." He did a little flourish with his gloved fingers, like a cheap magician, and produced 2 crisp $100 bills. I stared at the money, then up at his stitched, smiling face. $200 for cleaning up a murder scene, for bagging up bones and mopping up liquefied flesh, for being complicit. The ethical dilemma warred with the stark reality of my empty bank account. Right then, he probably could have asked me to lick the counter clean, and I might have considered it for that cash. Wordlessly, I took the money, stuffing it into my pocket, grabbed my phone, unstuck the pin from the check-in doll, and practically fled the shop without another word. Didn't look back. The weight of the money felt heavy, dirty. The smell of bleach and something far worse seemed to cling to my clothes, my skin. As I walked down the deserted highway strip, the sun starting to dip below the horizon, one thought echoed in my mind. What the hell have I gotten myself into? That $200 felt like 30 pieces of silver burning a hole in my pocket. I went home, showered until my skin was raw, scrubbing away the phantom stench of bleach and decay, but the feeling of wrongness clung to me like the shop's pervasive dust. Sleep offered little escape, filled with fragmented images. Melissa's melting face, the heavy thud from the basement, Casey's button eyes gleaming in the dark, the dolls. Always the dolls, watching from their dusty shelves. Going back to work the next day felt like walking willingly into a spider's web. But what choice did I have? Quitting meant facing my parents, admitting defeat, returning to the void of unemployment. Besides, a morbid, terrified part of me needed to know more. Needed to understand what monstrosity I was now entangled with. The shop was quiet when I arrived. KC wasn't immediately visible, which was both a relief and a source of fresh anxiety. Where was he lurking? I stabbed the pin into the counter doll, a little harder than necessary today, and took my seat. The floorboards where Melissa had dissolved looked darker, stained, no matter how much bleach I'd used. Permanent reminder. The morning dragged. No customers. Just the hum of unseen things. The creak of the old building settling. The faint, almost subliminal thump, thump, thump from the basement. I tried reading, scrolling through my phone, anything to distract myself. But my eyes kept flicking to the doll wall, to the basement door, to the scratched-out photos in Casey's office visible through the perpetually ajar door. Around noon, the bell clanged violently. I jumped, hand instinctively reaching for the bleach spray under the counter, my pathetic excuse for a weapon. A man stumbled in, beanie pulled low, hoodie up despite the mild weather, eyes darting around frantically. He looked wired, desperate, radiating bad news. He wasn't here for a potion. Before I could even manage my half-hearted welcome, a cheap revolver was shoved practically up my nostril. The cold metal pressed against my skin. "Easy, man," I squeaked, hands shooting up automatically. Adrenaline jolted through me, sharp and metallic tasting. "Shut up. Money. Now. Anyone else here?" He hissed, eyes wide and bloodshot, scanning the shop like a cornered rat. He reeked of stale sweat and cheap meth. My mind raced. Did Casey count? Did the thing in the basement count? My boss. Maybe? And basement thing? I stammered, nodding towards the locked door. This time, thankfully, it remained silent. He jabbed the gun harder. "Get your boss. Now, before I paint these creepy walls with your brains." He cocked the hammer, the click echoing ominously in the small space. Okay, chill." Hands still raised, I backed away slowly, heading towards Casey's office. The dolls on the wall seemed to lean forward, their painted or button eyes fixed on the intruder with unnerving intensity. Reaching the office door, I knocked, my knuckles rapping louder than I intended. "Mr. Creole? Customer needs you." The door swung open instantly. Casey stood there, immaculate in his suit and top hat, that stitched smile fixed in place. He looked past me, his button eyes landing on the gunman. The smile didn't falter, but it tightened somehow, became sharper, colder. He stepped out, fixing his purple tie, and strode calmly towards the counter, me trailing nervously behind him. The robber actually gasped when he saw KC. "Jesus Christ, what the hell are you?" Pretty standard reaction, but the gun stayed pointed. "Just the proprietor, good sir," KC rasped cheerfully. "What seems to be the trouble?" He clasped his gloved hands together, radiating an unnerving calm. "The register and the safe. Open him," the robber demanded, his voice cracking, eyes darting between KC and the still watching dolls. "No safe here, I'm afraid," KC hummed. "But the register? Travis, my boy, be so kind." He gave me another one of those back-breaking pats, sending me stumbling forward again, right into the gunman's line of sight. "Hey!" the robber yelped, waving the gun frantically between me and KC. Heart pounding, I scrambled behind the counter, hands still shaking, and hit the no sale button. The drawer sprang open with a loud cha-ching, and just like KC probably planned, it wasn't just holding the usual petty cash. It was overflowing. Bills stacked high hundreds, 50s, 20s. So much cash it literally popped some loose bills into the air. The robber's eyes went wide, greed momentarily overriding his fear. He shoved me aside, dropping the gun onto the counter with a clatter as he frantically started stuffing wads of cash into his hoodie pockets, his jeans, anywhere it would fit. "Now, Kevin." Casey's voice dropped, taking on that low, dangerous hum I recognized from Melissa's final moments. I instinctively took a step back. The robber, Kevin, apparently froze, cash halfway into his pocket. He looked up, confused and suddenly terrified again. How do you know my name?" He fumbled, grabbing the gun again, pointing it shakily at KC. "Didn't your mama ever teach you, Kevin?" Casey tooted, wagging a gloved finger. "Stealing is very, very bad." He took a slow step towards the robber. Kevin scrambled backward, shivering, gun trembling violently. "Stay back. Stay the hell back. And didn't anyone tell you?" Casey continued, his voice dangerously soft, still advancing. "Not to play with guns?" Kevin panicked. His finger tightened on the trigger. A deafening crack exploded in the confined space. My ears rang. I flinched, expecting KC to drop. He didn't. He just staggered slightly, his head jerking back with the impact. The stitches around his neck strained violently, a few threads snapping with an audible ping. Then, slowly, unervingly, he straightened up. His head lolled for a second before snapping back into place. Right in the center of his chalk-white forehead, a neat, black bullet hole appeared, oozing a thick, dark, tar-like substance. Kevin stared, mouth agape, gun hanging limply at his side. I wasn't doing much better. "Oh, Kevin, Kevin, Kevin," Casey sighed, the sound impossibly coming from his stitched mouth despite the hole in his head. The dark ooze stopped. The bullet hole seemed to shrink, closing like a malevolent eye. "Looks like I'll have to teach you a lesson." He chuckled, a truly horrifying sound. Kevin dropped the gun. It clattered uselessly on the floor. He held his hands up, shaking his head, whimpering. KC turned his button eyes towards me. "Travis, be a good boy. Look away, please." His voice was sickeningly sweet again. "Don't want you to watch this part." He then lunged, moving with that unnatural, jerky speed, grabbing the terrified robber by the throat, lifting him clean off the floor with one hand. I didn't need telling twice. I spun around, facing the dusty shelves, squeezing my eyes shut. Kevin started screaming, high-pitched, terrified pleas for help. Pleas directed at me. Funny how that worked. Then the screams turned wet, gurgling, replaced by sickening sounds. Tearing fabric, snapping bone, wet, percussive impacts, ripping flesh. I clamped my hands over my ears, but I couldn't block it out. The smell hit next, hot iron and something indescribably foul. I gagged again, fighting the urge to vomit. It seemed to go on forever. All done. Casey's cheerful rasp cut through the aftermath. My ears were still ringing. Trembling, I forced myself to turn around. Blood, so much blood, splattered across the floor, the counter, the opposite wall. But no body, just spatters and pools. And KC, standing there calmly, wiping his gloved hands on a handkerchief. The bullet hole in his forehead was completely gone. Then I saw it. On the blood-soaked counter, KC held up a grotesque marionette controller, fashioned not from wood, but from small, yellowish bones, finger bones, maybe? Dangling from the strings was a small, crudely made figure, barely 6 inches tall, dressed in tiny replicas of Kevin's clothes, dripping fresh blood. Its limbs jerked spastically as KC wiggled the bone controller. Don't appreciate folks threatening my employees, KC sighed, dropping the twitching, bloody marionette onto the counter, where it flopped obscenely. More blood smeared across the dusty surface. I stared, horrified, speechless. Thank you, sir. I managed eventually, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. Do you want me to clean? KC waved a dismissive hand, the tiny puppet mimicking the gesture. Don't you worry about the mess, Travis. He chuckled, then scooped up the bloody marionette, clenching it tightly in his fist. More blood oozed between his fingers. Just dispose of this for me, please? He kicked the dropped revolver towards me with his pristine dress shoe. Numbly, I picked up the gun. Heavy, still warm. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Went to the front door, stepped outside into the blessedly normal afternoon air, crossed the street to the alley dumpster, wiped the gun clean on my jeans, and tossed it in. Jogged back, needing the mundane act of tidying to ground me. When I re-entered, the shop was spotless. No blood, no gore, nothing. As if Kevin had never existed. KC was gone, presumably back in his office. The only evidence of the ordeal was the lingering metallic tang in the air and the faint tremor in my own hands. And the tiny, bloody bone controller marionette, now sitting silently on the counter, right next to the check-in doll. The days following the Kevin-turned-puppet incident settled into a new, more disturbing kind of normal. The shop remained eerily clean where the robbery and subsequent transformation had occurred. No trace remained, except for the tiny, grotesque marionette that KC occasionally took out, making it dance morbidly across the counter before tucking it away again somewhere in his spotless office. Seeing it always sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. I tried not to think about it. Tried not to think about Melissa either. Tried to just exist, ring up the occasional potion sale. Wart removal seemed oddly popular. Endure the silence, feel the weight of the doll's stares, and pointedly ignore the increasingly insistent sounds from the basement. The sobbing seemed louder now, more desperate. The scratching more frantic. The rhythmic thump, 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 sometimes felt like it was vibrating right up through the stool I sat on. KC was his usual unsettling self, appearing from nowhere, invading my personal space with his chalky presence, humming tuneless ditties behind his stitched mouth. He never mentioned Kevin. He never mentioned Melissa. It was as if these horrors were just mundane occurrences, footnotes in the shop's long, undoubtedly bloody history. His nonchalance was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all. I was working a late shift, a rare occurrence KC had insisted on because he had business elsewhere. Usually, I was out by 3, grateful to escape into the normal world. But tonight, I was stuck until 9, watching the shadows lengthen outside, the shop growing even darker and more oppressive as dusk bled into night. The dolls seemed more active in the dim light, their button and glass eyes gleaming, tiny shifts in posture making me jump at every creak. Around 8:30, maybe 15 minutes before I could finally escape, the front door burst open, the bell jangling violently. A man stumbled in, wild-eyed, clothes torn and stained with something dark, mud, blood, both. He slammed the door shut behind him, leaning heavily against it, gasping for breath. He looked back out the window frantically, then his eyes landed on me. "Hide me," he rasped, voice raw with panic. "Cops, gotta hide." He scrambled away from the door, ducking behind a tall shelf filled with dusty, unlabeled jars. Before I could even process, let alone react. The distinct sound of police sirens grew louder outside. Red and blue lights flashed, painting the shop's interior in strobing, frantic colors. My heart leaped into my throat. Cops. Here. Now. What the hell was I supposed to do? As the sirens wailed just outside, KC materialized beside the panicked man, appearing silently from the shadows near his office like he always did. The fugitive jumped, letting out a startled yelp. Now, what have we here? KC hummed, his stitched smile widening in the flashing police lights. He placed a disturbingly gentle hand on the man's shoulder. Get off me, freak! The man hissed, shoving Casey's hand away and pulling out a wicked-looking switchblade. Its blade gleamed red and blue. I need a place to hide. Now! He glanced frantically towards the front door, where the shadows of officers were now visible through the dusty glass. Casey didn't flinch at the knife. Instead, his smile broadened, turning predatory. Why, certainly, son, he crooned, his voice dripping with false sweetness. Right this way. Got the perfect spot for you. To my absolute horror, KC started leading the man, not towards his office or some back room, but directly towards the basement door. My stomach plummeted. I wanted to scream, to warn him, but fear kept me rooted to the spot. Faster, you creepy bastard, the man urged, eyes glued to the front door as knocking began. They're here. KC took his sweet time, fumbling with the keys like a doddering old man, drawing out the tension. Finally, he unlocked the multiple deadbolts on the basement door, the heavy thunks echoing in the suddenly silent shop. The knocking outside had stopped. He swung the door open, revealing the familiar pitch-black maw and releasing that gut-wrenching stench of decay and wrongness. After you, KC gestured grandly, stepping aside. The fugitive didn't hesitate. Desperate, seeing only escape, he practically dove into the darkness. KC slammed the heavy door shut behind him, the locks clicking firmly into place. Just as he pocketed the key, the knocking on the front door resumed, louder this time. And that, KC hummed, turning to face the front door, his button eyes glittering with cold amusement, is that. He completely ignored the muffled, terrified scream that erupted from behind the basement door, quickly followed by the sounds of frantic banging, tearing, and then a final, choked-off gurgle. Silence returned, heavy and absolute, save for the insistent pounding on the shop's front door. KC looked over at me, his stitched smile unwavering, completely unfazed by the sounds of murder he'd just orchestrated. He simply nodded towards the front door. Handle that, Travis, would you? Tell them they must be mistaken. He then turned and glided silently back towards his office, leaving me alone to face the police, the echo of screams still ringing in my ears, and the fresh, horrifying knowledge of what, exactly, waited in the dark beneath old King Creole's half-priced voodoo shop. My feet felt glued to the floorboards. Outside, the insistent thump-thump-thump of police fists rattled the shop's front door. Behind me, the heavy oak basement door stood silent, a tomb sealing away the fugitive's final, horrific moments. And somewhere in the back, KC was probably polishing his bone marionettes? Who the hell knew? Police! Open up! A gruff voice called from outside. Right. Handle it. Easy for KC to say. My palms were sweating, my heart doing a frantic drum solo against my ribs. What was I supposed to tell them? Sorry, officers. The guy you're looking for just got eaten by whatever lives in our murder basement. Can I interest you in a wart removal potion while you're here? Yeah, that'd go over well. Taking a shaky breath, I forced my legs to move, walked towards the front door, trying to look bored, annoyed even. Just a tired shop clerk dealing with late-night disturbances. Plastered on the fakest smile I could manage, I pulled the door open a crack, peering out. 2 officers stood there, silhouetted against the flashing red and blue lights of their cruiser. Stern faces, hands resting near their sidearms. The older one, grizzled with a thick mustache, stepped forward. Evening. We're looking for a suspect. Fled this way. Seen anyone unusual come in here in the last 10 minutes. My mind raced. Like, keep it simple. Stick to Casey's script. Unusual? I scoffed, trying to sound genuinely perplexed. Sir, look at this place. I gestured vaguely inside. Everyone who comes in here is unusual. But no, haven't seen anyone matching, well, whoever you're looking for. Just closing up shop. The mustached officer eyed me, then peered past me into the dimly lit, dusty interior. Mind if we take a look around? Just routine. Panic flared. The bloodstains near the basement door, though faint, might still be visible. The lingering smell. Sure, I stammered, stepping aside reluctantly. Place is a mess, though. Boss is kind of a collector. The 2 officers stepped inside, flashlights cutting beams through the dusty air. They did a cursory sweep, looked behind the counter, shone lights down the aisles cluttered with bizarre artifacts, paused near the basement door. My breath hitched. What's in there? The younger officer asked, pointing his flashlight at the multiple locks. Storage, I blurted out, maybe a little too quickly. Old inventory. Boss keeps it locked up tight. Rats, you know. The older officer nudged the door with his foot, testing its solidity. He looked back at me, his eyes sharp, assessing. For a tense moment, I thought he was going to demand I open it. But then, a faint, muffled sob echoed from deep within the basement. We all froze. What was that? The younger officer asked, hand moving towards his gun. My blood ran cold. She was still down there, and apparently, she wasn't happy about her new roommate. Before I could even formulate another lie, KC appeared, gliding silently out of his office. Officers, is there a problem? He asked, his voice smooth, that stitched smile firmly in place. He completely ignored the sob that had just emanated from the basement. The older officer turned, clearly startled by KC's sudden appearance and unnerving features. Sir, we're searching for a fugitive. Ah, yes, the poor fellow. KC interrupted with a sigh, shaking his head sadly. Saw him run past just moments before you arrived. Headed towards the old woods back behind the property. He gestured vaguely towards the rear of the shop. Fast little fella. Hope you catch him. The officers exchanged a look. KC's explanation was plausible, delivered with utter confidence. The sob hadn't repeated. Maybe they'd imagined it? All right? The older officer said finally, clearly deciding it wasn't worth pushing further in this creepy-ass voodoo shop. Thanks for your time. Let us know if you see anything else. Will do, officers. Have a safe night, KC chirped, practically beaming as he ushered them out the door. He watched until their cruiser pulled away, lights still flashing, heading towards the woods he'd indicated. Then he turned back to me, his smile vanishing, replaced by that cold, calculating look. You handled that adequately, Travis, he said, the compliment feeling more like a threat. He walked over to the basement door, placing a hand flat against the wood. Silence emanated from within. "She's getting restless," he murmured, almost to himself. Then louder, addressing the door, "You will behave, Mary. You know the consequences." A low, guttural growl answered him from the depths. KC ignored it, turning back to me. "Time to lock up," he announced, his tone shifting back to disturbingly cheerful. "Long night. You get some rest, my boy. Big day tomorrow." He started towards his office. "Sir," I called out, my voice trembling slightly despite myself. What happens now? With the guy down there?" Casey paused at his office door, looking back over his shoulder, his button eyes unreadable in the dim light. "Why, Travis?" he rasped, the stitches stretching with his grotesque smile. "She eats, of course. Waste not, want not." He chuckled, a dry, horrifying sound, and disappeared into his office, leaving me alone in the silent, dusty shop, the faint, lingering smell of blood and fear thick in the air, and the chilling certainty that I was trapped in a nightmare far deeper and darker than I had ever dared to imagine. Locking up the shop that night felt different. Usually, it was a sigh of relief, escaping the oppressive atmosphere for the relative sanity of the outside world. Tonight, it felt like sealing a tomb. Each click of the deadbolt echoed the finality of the fugitive's fate downstairs. The street outside was deserted, the flashing police lights long gone, leaving only the weak, flickering glow of the shop's neon sign casting eerie shadows. I didn't drive straight home, couldn't. Ended up parked by the reservoir on the edge of town, staring out at the dark, still water, the 200 blood-soaked dollars heavy in my pocket. "She eats, of course." Casey's casual words replayed in my mind, sending waves of revulsion through me. Mary, whatever she was down there, was a prisoner, a monster, and apparently Casey's personal disposal unit. How many others had ended up in that basement? How many desperate souls lured in by the promise of free wishes, only to become food? Was Melissa down there? Was Kevin, the twitching marionette, somehow spared that fate? Or was his transformation just a prelude? The questions gnawed at me, fueled by a terrifying cocktail of guilt and morbid fascination. I was an accessory. I'd cleaned up Melissa's remains, tossed the bag into that abyss. I'd stood by while KC led the fugitive to his doom. $20 an hour. What was my soul worth? Apparently, less than minimum wage. Sleep, when it finally came hours later in my own bed, was a chaotic mess of button eyes, stitched smiles, melting flesh, scratching claws from behind a heavy oak door, and the vacant, accusing stares of hundreds of dolls. The next few days were tense. KC acted as if nothing had happened, humming his tuneless melodies, occasionally appearing beside me with startling suddenness to offer unwanted advice on shelf-dusting techniques, as if. He even brought out the Kevin marionette once, dangling it over the counter while asking if I thought the tiny stitches holding its limbs together were up to snuff. I nearly threw up my lukewarm coffee. The basement remained quiet. No sobbing, no scratching, no banging. Just a heavy, oppressive silence that felt, if possible, even worse. Had she finished? Was she sleeping? Waiting? I found myself avoiding that side of the shop, my eyes skittering away from the locked door whenever I had to pass it. The shard of porcelain in my pocket felt heavier, a constant, nagging reminder of the darkness lurking below. Then, about 3 days after the incident with the fugitive, something new happened. A woman came into the shop. Not unusual in itself, but this woman, she felt different. Older, maybe late 60s, dressed impeccably in a vintage tweed suit, carrying an expensive leather briefcase. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, her eyes sharp and intelligent behind elegant glasses. She moved with an air of quiet authority that seemed utterly out of place in the dusty, dilapidated voodoo shop. She didn't browse, didn't look at the dolls or the potion shelves. She walked straight to the counter, placing her briefcase deliberately upon it, wincing slightly at the layer of dust. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice crisp, educated, with a faint, unplaceable accent. "I am here to see King Creole. We have an appointment." An appointment? KC had appointments? This was news to me. Yes, ma'am," I stammered. "Let me just..." Before I could move, KC was there, gliding out from his office. He wasn't smiling his usual stitched grin. His posture was different, less jerky, almost formal. He gave a slight, stiff bow. "Madame Evangeline," he rasped, the stitches pulling tight. "You are punctual as always." "Punctuality is the courtesy of kings, Creole," she replied coolly, her sharp eyes scanning him, lingering for a moment on the stitches around his neck. "Shall we?" KC nodded silently and gestured towards his office. As Madame Evangeline walked past, her gaze swept over me, cool and appraising. For a split second, her eyes seemed to flash, not with reflected light, but with an internal, cold luminescence. A shiver traced its way down my spine. She followed KC into his office, and he closed the door firmly behind them, the first time I'd ever seen him fully close it. I stood there, bewildered. Who was she? What kind of appointment did one have with King Creole? The air in the shop felt charged, tense. Even the dolls on the wall seemed unusually still, as if holding their collective breath. Muffled voices drifted from the office, too low to make out words, but the cadence was intense, argumentative. Once I heard something shatter glass, maybe, then silence again. 15 minutes passed. 20. Suddenly, the office door flew open. Madame Evangeline strode out, face like thunder, clutching her briefcase. She didn't look at me, just marched straight to the front door and slammed it shut behind her, the bell jangling furiously. A moment later, KC emerged. His stitched smile was back, but it looked forced, brittle. There was a fresh, dark stain blooming on the front of his purple tie, like spilled ink or something else. He didn't say anything, just walked behind the counter, picked up the blank check-in doll, and stared at it intently, turning it over and over in his gloved hands. "Trouble, boss," I ventured cautiously. He looked up, his button eyes focusing on me, but seemingly looking right through me. "Inventory, Travis?" he said abruptly, his voice flat, devoid of its usual rasping cheer. "We need to do inventory. Inventory. We never did inventory." The shop restocked itself. Before I could ask what he meant, he tossed the check-in doll onto the counter and walked stiffly towards the basement door, pulling out the key. "Starting down here," he muttered, unlocking the deadbolts. He paused, hand on the knob, and looked back at me, a strange, almost desperate light flickering in his button eyes. "Stay here. Don't let anyone in." He opened the door and disappeared into the blackness, pulling it shut behind him. The locks clicked one by one, and then, from the depths, came a sound I hadn't heard before. Not sobbing, not scratching, not banging. It was laughter, high-pitched, cold, utterly inhuman laughter, echoing up from the darkness below, and it sounded chillingly familiar. It sounded like Madame Evangeline. The click of the final basement lock echoed in the suffocating silence. KC was down there, with her, and that cold, mocking laughter, impossibly like Madame Evangeline's, still seemed to hang in the dusty air. Inventory, starting in the basement, it made zero sense. Nothing KC did ever truly made sense, but this felt different. Darker. The brittle cheerfulness was gone, replaced by a flat, almost desperate urgency. Don't let anyone in. I stood frozen behind the counter, straining to hear anything from below. The usual frantic scrabbling and sobbing were absent. Instead, there was nothing. A profound, unnerving stillness that was somehow more menacing than the usual cacophony. The shop felt like it was holding its breath. My eyes darted around the room. The dolls on the wall seemed unusually rigid, their button and glass eyes fixed forward, no longer tracking my movements. Even the check-in doll on the counter sat perfectly still, facing the front door, its pin undisturbed. It was like the animating force, the creepy sentience that usually permeated the place, had withdrawn, retreating with KC into the depths. Inventory. The word rattled around in my head. What inventory? The shop restocked itself. Unless he wasn't talking about dolls and potions. What else was down there besides Mary and the remains of unfortunate souls? My gaze drifted towards KC's office door, still slightly ajar from when he'd stormed out after confronting me about the library. Madame Evangeline. Who was she? Why did her visit throw KC into such a state? What was in that briefcase? Against my better judgment, spurred by a desperate need for answers, and maybe a subconscious desire to delay thinking about what might be happening beneath my feet, I crept towards the office. Pushed the door open silently. Nothing seemed changed at first glance. Spotless desk, scratched out photos, worn leather chair. But the air felt different here too. Colder. And there was a faint, almost imperceptible scent lingering, not dust or decay, but something sharp, metallic, almost like ozone after a lightning strike. Evangeline's perfume? I scanned the desk. No briefcase, just KC's usual assortment of buttons, threads, and strange, archaic-looking tools. I cautiously opened the top desk drawer. More sewing supplies, spare buttons identical to the ones sewn onto KC's face, spools of thick black thread. Nothing unusual. Second drawer. Files. Neatly labeled, but the labels were meaningless symbols, not words. Pulled one out. Inside, pages filled with cramped, spidery handwriting KC's, interspersed with complex diagrams that looked like bizarre anatomical charts mixed with circuit board layouts. And names. Lists of names, some crossed out, some with dates beside them. Melissa, Kevin, the fugitive, dozens more I didn't recognize. Were these records? Of his victims, of the wishes. My blood ran cold. I shoved the file back, heart pounding. This was worse than I thought. This wasn't just random voodoo weirdness. It was organized, cataloged horror. Then I saw it. Tucked at the back of the drawer, almost hidden, was a small, velvet-lined box. Not locked. Trembling slightly, I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on the faded velvet, weren't buttons or threads, but teeth. Small, human-looking teeth. Dozens of them, yellowed, some chipped, some disturbingly sharp. Bile rose in my throat again. I slammed the drawer shut, stumbling back from the desk. What was he? What kind of inventory involved files filled with cryptic diagrams and a box of human teeth? Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from the basement, followed by a muffled, inhuman shriek of pain, not Mary's usual sobbing, something guttural, agonized. I froze, listening. Silence again, heavier than before. Then the unmistakable sound of the basement locks being undone, one by one. Thunk, thunk, thunk. He was coming back. Panic seized me. I scrambled out of the office, pulling the door almost shut, and dove behind the counter just as the basement door creaked open. I held my breath, peering through a gap between jars of pickled something. KC emerged from the darkness. He looked different. His usual stiff, jerky movements were gone, replaced by a slow, deliberate glide. His head was held high, not wobbling. The stitched smile was still there, but it seemed etched deeper, crueler. And his button eyes, they weren't just black anymore. Deep within them, tiny pinpricks of red light glowed, like embers in a dying fire. The dark stain on his tie was gone, his suit immaculate once more. He carried nothing. He locked the basement door, humming that same tuneless melody, but it sounded distorted now, discordant, like a warped record. He didn't look towards the counter. Instead, he walked directly to the doll wall, his glowing red eyes scanning the rows upon rows of figures. He reached out a gloved hand, fingers unnaturally long now, it seemed, and plucked a specific doll from the wall, one I hadn't paid much attention to before, dressed in simple farmer's overalls. He held it up, examining it closely. "Almost time," he rasped, his voice deeper, rougher than usual, the sound seeming to scrape against the inside of his stitched throat. "The collection requires refinement." He turned then, his glowing red gaze sweeping across the shop, landing directly on my hiding spot behind the counter. He knew I was there. He knew I'd been in his office. His stitched smile widened, stretching the threads to their breaking point. The red pinpricks in his button eyes flared brighter. "Travis, my boy," he purred, the sound sending icy tendrils down my spine. "Excellent news. You've just been promoted." Promoted? My blood turned to ice water. Given everything I'd witnessed in this godforsaken shop, a promotion from King Creole sounded less like a career advancement and more like a one-way ticket to becoming basement chow or a twitching marionette. I stayed frozen behind the counter, my mind frantically trying to process KC's altered state, the glide, the deeper voice, the glowing red embers smoldering in his button eyes. Whatever happened down there with Mary and Madame Evangeline hadn't just been an argument. It was a fundamental shift. "P promoted," I stammered, hating the tremor in my voice. "To what?" KC chuckled, that new, rougher sound scraping against my nerves. He set the farmer doll down gently on the counter, handling it with an odd reverence. "Why, to Assistant Curator Travis. Effective immediately." He spread his unnaturally long fingers wide. "This establishment, this collection requires a more discerning eye. Someone with potential. Someone," his glowing gaze fixed on me, "malleable. Assistant Curator? Of what? A collection of dusty voodoo junk and bottled nightmares?" Before I could ask, he gestured towards the front door with a sharp, almost imperious flick of his wrist. "First task," he rasped. "Flip the sign. We're closed. Permanently." My jaw dropped. Closed? But the wishes? The potions? The steady stream of victims? I left that unsaid. "The business model is evolving," KC interrupted smoothly, those red embers intensifying for a moment. "The retail aspect has served its purpose. Time for a more focused approach. He picked up the farmer doll again, turning it over in his hands. Time to refine the collection, prune the unnecessary acquisitions. A cold dread washed over me. Refine the collection. Prune? Was he talking about the dolls on the wall? Were they more than just creepy decorations? Were they connected to real people like Kevin? And what did he mean by unnecessary? Swallowing hard, I did as I was told, walking on unsteady legs to the front door and flipping the battered open sign to its faded closed side. The finality of the act felt heavy, like locking the last door on a sinking ship. As I turned back, KC was still examining the farmer doll. "This one," he murmured, almost to himself, tracing the doll's stitched overalls with a gloved finger. An early piece, crudely made but foundational, represents a regrettable necessity from a bygone era. He suddenly looked up at me, his red-tinged gaze sharp. "Tell me, Travis, what do you know about roots?" "Roots?" I asked, confused. "Like tree roots." He let out a short, sharp bark of laughter that held no humor. "Precisely. Everything has roots, my boy. This shop, this town, me. Sometimes roots grow deep and strong. Other times," his grip tightened on the farmer doll, the fabric creaking under the pressure. "They become tangled, rotten. They choke the life out of everything else. They need to be cut away." He placed the farmer doll back on the counter, positioning it carefully so it faced the basement door. "Madame Evangeline's visit was illuminating," he continued, his voice dropping again, becoming almost conversational, which was somehow even more terrifying. "Reminded me of certain obligations, certain loose ends that require tending." He glided towards the basement door again, pulling out the key. "Your promotion comes with new responsibilities, Travis, including access." He paused, hand on the lock, and looked back at me, that stitched smile stretching unnaturally wide, revealing glimpses of disturbingly sharp, yellowed teeth behind the threads. The red embers in his eyes seemed to pulse. "First lesson for the assistant curator," he rasped, the sound like grinding stones. "Always inspect the foundations. Make sure nothing undesirable is trying to claw its way back up." He inserted the key into the lock, the metallic click echoing like a gunshot in the dead silence of the closed shop. "Wouldn't want any surprises, would we?" He began to turn the key. "Okay, here is the final part 10, of The Stitch-Mouthed King and the Half-Priced Soul. The Stitch-Mouthed King and the Half-Priced Soul Part 10. The key turned. The final lock clicked open. A wave of that same indescribable, cold wrongness washed up from the basement, thicker, more potent than ever before. It carried the stench of ancient dust, dried blood, and something else, ozone? Like the faint smell in Casey's office after Evangeline's visit, but stronger, sharper. KC pulled the heavy door inward, revealing only absolute blackness. No light penetrated the depths. He stood there for a moment, silhouetted against the void, the red pinpricks in his button eyes seeming to pierce the darkness. He didn't step inside. "Inspection time, Travis?" he rasped, his voice echoing slightly as if speaking into a vast, empty space. He turned his head, still unervingly steady on his stitched neck, and fixed his glowing gaze on me. "Your first duty as assistant curator. Go ensure our foundation is secure. Report back immediately. Go down there, alone, after everything I'd heard, after the laughter." My whole body recoiled. "Sir, I don't think," Casey glided towards me, moving with that unsettling smoothness. He placed a hand, colder than ever, on my shoulder. His grip was like iron. "This is not a request, Travis," he purred, the sound vibrating unpleasantly through my bones. "It's a requirement of your new position. A test, if you will. Prove your loyalty. Prove your suitability." His stitched smile stretched wider, the threads looking paper-thin, the sharp teeth gleaming behind them. The red embers in his eyes pulsed rhythmically. "Don't disappoint me." He released my shoulder and gestured emphatically towards the open basement door. The implication was terrifyingly clear. Refuse, and face consequences far worse than whatever lurked below. My mind screamed no, but my feet, seemingly disconnected from my will, began to move. Shaking, barely breathing, I approached the yawning abyss. The cold intensified, radiating outwards, raising goosebumps on my skin despite the relative warmth of the shop. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight app, its weak beam swallowed almost instantly by the oppressive darkness. One step, then another. The rickety wooden stairs groaned under my weight, sounding impossibly loud in the dead silence. The stench intensified with each step, burning my nostrils, making my eyes water. Below, the flashlight beam revealed nothing but more stairs descending into infinite blackness. The air felt thick, heavy, difficult to draw into my lungs. I glanced back up. Casey stood framed in the doorway, a tall, dark silhouette against the dim shop light, his red eyes burning down at me. Watching, waiting, forcing myself forward, I continued the descent. 10 steps, 20, 30, deeper than should have been possible. The sound started then, faint whispers, seeming to come from the very walls, slithering around my ears, unintelligible but filled with malice and ancient hunger. A faint, wet scraping sound echoed from somewhere far below. Thump, 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 not loud banging this time. A slow, measured, heavy beat, like something enormous, patiently waiting in the dark. My flashlight beam flickered erratically. I reached the bottom, not the concrete floor I remembered from chucking the bag down, but packed earth, cold and damp beneath my worn sneakers. I swept the light around. The basement wasn't just a room anymore. It was a cavern, vast, impossibly large, stretching away into shadows that swallowed the light. Strange, root-like structures snaked across the floor and hung from the impossibly high ceiling, pulsing faintly with a dim, sickly green luminescence. And the bodies, gods, the bodies, dozens, maybe hundreds, in various states of decay, were arranged like grotesque exhibits. Some hung from the roots by Casey's signature black thread, limbs contorted, mouths sewn shut. Others were piled in corners, half devoured, porcelain shards scattered amongst them like broken teeth. This wasn't storage. This was a charnel house, a larder. In the center of the cavern, where I dimly recalled seeing Mary huddled before, stood a crude stone altar. Upon it lay the farmer doll Casey had been holding earlier. Arranged around it in a disturbing tableau were other dolls. Kevin, the bloody marionette, lay crumpled at its feet. Another, vaguely resembling Melissa, lay face down, its stuffing spilling out. "Inspection complete, Travis?" Casey's voice echoed from the top of the stairs, startlingly close despite the distance. Yes, sir," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper, still reeling from the horrific panorama. "Excellent," he rasped. "Then the refinement can begin. Suddenly, the farmer doll on the altar moved. Its head twitched, then slowly turned, its painted eyes fixing on me. A low groan emanated from it, growing louder, resonating through the cavern. The green luminescence from the roots intensified. The whispers grew into a cacophony of voices, screaming, pleading, cursing. The bodies hanging from the ceiling began to twitch, animated by some unseen force. The pile of bones and porcelain shards in the corner shifted, coalescing, reforming into the broken, crawling shape of Mary, her one good eye burning with hatred as she scrabbled towards the altar. Thump, thump, thump. The heavy beat from the darkness grew louder, shaking the very ground beneath me. "Welcome to the roots, Travis," Casey's voice boomed, no longer raspy but full, powerful, ancient. "Welcome to the true collection." I looked back up towards the doorway, desperate to escape, only to find it blocked. Not by KC, but by the check-in doll from the counter, now life-sized, its blank face splitting open to reveal rows upon rows of needle-sharp teeth, its fabric arms reaching down towards me. My promotion, I realized with sickening certainty, wasn't just assistant curator. It was becoming part of the exhibit, part of the refinement, another doll for King Creole's ever-growing, horrifying collection. The last thing I heard before the screaming darkness consumed me was KC's distorted laughter, echoing endlessly from the abyss.